Nama Om Vishnupada Krishna Presta Bhutale Shrimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharne Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Shatarne Sri Krishna Caitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadha Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Vanchakalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhya evacha, Paritanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Hare Krishna. So devotees, here we are in the beginning of the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita, titled Contents of the Gita Summarized. And we did explain on Friday how it has that title, how it's presenting so many different topics which are then going to be discussed at greater length as we go through the other chapters in Bhagavad Gita. So that's the nature of this second chapter. And we're in the first part, the first section, which we've titled, let me just, Further Complaints of Arjuna. More doubts, but Arjuna starts to surrender. Yes. Okay. So first couple of two verses we read. Let's go into verse 3 now. So the way we are doing this, just so you know what our system is that every verse, we will read the translation, every verse, and then we will give, you could say, a very brief summary of the purport. Of course, normally like in Srimad Bhagavatam class or just generally, when we're giving class on a verse, then we read the verse, like on the Sunday program or Srimad Bhagavatam class in the morning, like that. So we read the verse, we read the whole purport, and then we comment, give clarifications, generally, basically on what is stated in the purport. And for the whole class, that's what we do. Here, though, like this evening, let's see how many verses we get through, but I would expect it to be at least 10. It could easily be more, actually. So obviously we can't analyze each purport in depth and just painstakingly go through just everything which is said there and elaborate, obviously. So what we will do, though, we will go through each purport, and you can read through as we'll just draw out some of the main points, paragraph by paragraph. This is how we do it. And some of these points are going to come up in your tests, actually. So therefore, as we're drawing out these different points, we do recommend you write them down. Yes, because definitely some are coming up in the tests. Okay, so here we go. We're starting with verse 3, and it is, well, Krishna already spoke in the first chapter just very briefly, and it was not like an instruction. You should do this, or you need to change in this way or that. It was just something simple about the chariot going in between the armies and have a look and see, that sort of thing, see who's there. Now in verse 2, which we read on Friday night, Krishna did give definitely more of like a real instruction, and it was a little cutting. In fact, let me just read that verse again, and then we'll go on to verse 3. So Lord Krishna says, "My dear Arjuna, how have these impurities come upon you? They're not at all befitting a man who knows the value of life. They lead not to higher planets, but to infamy." So that's a chastisement. That's definitely a strong chastisement for Arjuna from Krishna. And Krishna continues in verse 3, "O son of Pritha, do not yield to this degrading impotence. It does not become you. Give up such petty weakness of heart and arise, O chastiser of the enemy." So again, it's strong. Can you imagine being told by anyone really, but particularly someone who's very senior to you, that you are in a degraded condition? Yes, you are influenced, you are affected by degrading impotence. Phew, that's heavy. Yes, it doesn't become you. Come on, wake up. Give up this petty weakness of heart. You're weak. Yes, and arise. And then you could say, arguably, possibly in sarcastic terms, "O chastiser of the enemy." Arjuna is not in much of a mood of chastising anyone. But Krishna's trying to wake him up. So let's have a look at a few of the points in the purport. The first point is, we should note in the first couple of sentences that Srila Prabhupada is drawing out the fact that Arjuna and Lord Krishna have a blood relationship. They're directly first cousins, because Pritha, the mother of Arjuna, was the sister of Krishna's father, Vasudeva. So they are, by sort of Vedic terms, they're brothers, they're cousin brothers. You could hardly have a closer relationship. So in other words, Krishna may feel embarrassed. Here's one of my close relatives acting like a fool and making our family seem foolish. So anyway, Prabhupada goes on to make the point that if you want to be called a Kshatriya, you have to act as a Kshatriya. And he also mentions if you want to be accepted as a real Brahmin, you have to conduct yourself like a real Brahmin. Otherwise, you are just a Kshatriya or a Brahmin in name only, which is, it's almost like a pathetic position. There's the practice, a Vedic practice, and we see it in the chapter in the first canto of the Bhagavatam, when Ashvatthama is captured and there's a debate what to do with him. Kill him, spare his life, or what? And he is the son of Dronacharya. No, wait a minute. He's the son of Kripacharya. Dronacharya. He's the son of Dronacharya. Dronacharya, he's Acharya, he's a Brahmin. I mean, he's an unusual kind of Brahmin-Kshatriya mix, but officially he's a Brahmin. So he is referred to there as Brahma Bandhu, the friend of a Brahmin. This is the terminology which is used often, at least back in those Vedic times, in this type of context, when someone is the son, is the member of a good family of, in that case, Brahmins, but now the person has degraded themselves. Then there's this practice of calling the person Brahma Bandhu, which means friend of a Brahmin, or Kshatriya Bandhu, friend of a Kshatriya. And effectively, it's like an insult, actually. So Krishna didn't want that. And it really, we're going through the purport. I hope you're just sort of looking your way through. Don't wait for me. Just have a look through, see the points that are made. It didn't fit the usual character of Arjuna. He was a brave man, extremely brave, extremely powerful. Therefore, amongst the warriors on his side on the battlefield, Duryodhana and the leaders on the other side, they were practically more afraid of Arjuna than anyone else. So this weakness is just so out of character and so unbecoming for Arjuna. And Prabhupada makes the point, it's sort of 2/3 of the way down, that Arjuna might argue that he's being magnanimous, he's being generous. He doesn't want to be hard with his seniors. But Krishna says, no, it's not generosity, magnanimity, it's just weakness. So stop it. No authority will accept it. So just give it up. We go on to verse 4. Now Arjuna responds, and he tries, he's trying to actually debate with Krishna. Not a good idea, but at least he's trying to. So he tries to debate by effectively saying in verse 4, it's not weakness, it's generosity. Well, we mentioned already. Arjuna said, O killer of enemies, O killer of Madhu, how can I counterattack with arrows in battle men like Bhishma and Drona who are worthy of my worship? In the purport, Srila Prabhupada, the way Prabhupada has been addressing some of these statements of Arjuna's, and this one included, is even, you could say, a little unusual, really, but he does bring out these valuable, interesting points. Like when we read in verse, I think it was 27 in the first chapter, Arjuna's expressing great concern that he doesn't want to fight for different reasons. And Prabhupada explained there at some length that this actually shows that he is a man of good character. He's a soft-hearted person. Although we know, and we're in the process of finding out, and it's going to become vividly clear just shortly, that actually Krishna does not approve. He does not approve. And quite the opposite. He chastises and he becomes sarcastic with Arjuna for expressing himself in these types of ways. So anyway, in the purport, Prabhupada makes the point, just expanding from Arjuna's point of view, that Bhishma and Drona, they're superiors, they're always worshipable. Even if they attack, we shouldn't counterattack them. Seniors should not be offered even a verbal fight, should just accept, never be harshly treated. So it's how, and Prabhupada, on behalf of Arjuna, hypothetically asks, would Krishna ever attack his own grandfather, Ugrasena, or his teacher, Sandipani Muni? At least these are the arguments. These are the arguments which Arjuna is trying to present. Although, for example, in regard to the respectableness of Bhishma and Drona specifically, it's already been pointed out in the first chapter that they are aggressors. What to speak of not really being truly respectable? They're aggressors who should be killed. So therefore, Arjuna, even though he's well-intentioned, soft-hearted, but he's really got the wrong idea. Srila Prabhupada makes a comment in a class on one of these verses. Just listen to this. And Arjuna addresses Krishna, Madhusudana, or the killer of the demon Madhu. Yes, you're addressing me as a chastiser of the enemy, but do you think my grandfather, my teacher, are my enemies? This is Prabhupada's presenting as Arjuna. You're calling me chastiser of the enemies, but are you saying these people, my grandfather Bhishma and Dronacharya, are they my enemies? You killed the demon Madhu, therefore your name is Madhusudana, but you're asking me to kill my grandfather and teacher. That is the hint. It is all right that your name is Madhusudana. You killed one demon whose name was Madhu. Sudana means killer. But you are asking me, Bhishma Sudana. Bhishma is my grandfather, and Drona Sudana. So how can I be that? He's trying his best. Arjuna, he's trying. So we go on to verse 5. Now, as we did mention on Friday, that, and it's there in the sort of the little title we've given to this section, Arjuna's further doubts. So from verse 5, which we're about to read right now, through basically all the verses till 9, Arjuna is basically repeating the same doubts. So number 5, he repeats the doubt about being fearful of sinful reactions, which was there. There was a few verses in the first chapter which was all about how it'll be sinful to kill these people. So again, Arjuna says, verse 5, it would be better to live in this world by begging than to live at the cost of the lives of great souls who are my teachers. Even though desiring worldly gain, they are superiors. If they're killed, everything we enjoy will be tainted with blood. In other words, sinful reaction. So Prabhupada, in the purport, in the verse we can see Arjuna's afraid of getting sinful reactions. But in the purport, Srila Prabhupada immediately takes the position of Krishna that if a teacher like Drona or a senior grandfather like Bhishma becomes engaged in abominable activity, then they must be abandoned. You shouldn't sentimentally hold on to them. They should be abandoned. And Bhishma and Drona, they fall into that category of becoming engaged in abominable activity because they have taken the side of Duryodhana just for basically financial kind of social, but more financial reasons. So that's bad. Therefore, they should be rejected. They should be rejected, actually. And one should not, as Arjuna is trying to say, just carry on respecting them, worshipping them, etc., etc. Yes, and Prabhupada, what does he say? Concludes the purport. Therefore, to enjoy material profits after killing them, it's just what Arjuna feels. But Arjuna thinks that nevertheless they remain as superiors, and therefore to enjoy material profits after killing them would mean to enjoy spoils tainted with blood, but it's not the case. And now we go on to, verse 6, right? Now we go on to verse 6. And it's a repeat of the category of doubt of Arjuna from the first chapter, based on indecision. Don't know what to do. Do this, do that, don't know what to do. And therefore we become sort of paralyzed, immobilized, and just dysfunctional. So the verses, nor do we know which is better. Wait a minute, sorry. Where are we? 6, sorry. Nor do we know which is better, conquering them or being conquered by them. If we killed the sons of Dhritarashtra, we should not care to live. Yet they are now standing before us on the battlefield. In fact, it's basically 6, 7, 8, and 9, which are exploring the idea of indecision further. Okay, so anyway, it's indecision. Obviously, we don't know which is better, conquer them or being conquered by them. But as Prabhupada points out at the beginning of the purport, when you're a Kshatriya, you don't get into these types of moral or quasi-moral dilemmas. You're a Kshatriya, you must fight. So that's Kshatriya Dharma. And there's no room, really, for getting mental about it. So therefore, Arjuna's indecision is wrong, and it's not Kshatriya standard. It's not Kshatriya standard. Arjuna's feeling that, if they die, I will miss them, basically. I will miss them. And I will not be able to enjoy life doing whatever pastimes we used to do together. So it's a nonsense. It's a nonsense. However, Srila Prabhupada makes a very interesting point. If you look there, right in the middle of the purport, Prabhupada says, all these considerations by Arjuna definitely proved that not only was he a great devotee of the Lord, but he was also highly enlightened and had complete control over his mind and senses. And just read on through the purport and you'll see he's willing to take up a life of begging. Shows he's very detached. There's some spiritual advancement there, which you would expect because he's a great devotee. And indeed, Prabhupada concludes, it is concluded that Arjuna was quite fit for liberation. Unfortunately, of course, Krishna does not see it that way. And how Krishna sees things, that is the way things get to be seen. That's the whole story of Bhagavad Gita, isn't it? Krishna's viewpoint comes out. That's the viewpoint. So despite Arjuna, in different ways saying things which can be taken as being nice, but they're rejected. Srila Prabhupada, here's another little excerpt from a class by Prabhupada. Shri Shri Radha Radhanath Shri Giri Govardhan Shri Caitanya Mahaprabhu Ki. So here's another excerpt from a class by Prabhupada. Arjuna is perplexed whether he should continue with this battle. There's a proverb in Bengal, when you're perplexed whether I shall eat or not eat, better not eat. Sometimes we come to this point, I am not very hungry, whether I shall eat or not eat. The best course is to not eat. But if you eat, then you can eat in the month of December. Why? Bengal has a tropical climate, and when it's winter, it is advised that if you eat, it is not so harmful because it will be digested. The night is very long, it's the cold season, the digestive power is nice. But when we're confused to do or not to do, then you think, shall I go or not? Better don't go. But when it is a question of answering the call of nature, you must go. This is common sense. Similarly, Arjuna was perplexed whether, shall I fight or shall I not fight? So next verse, and this is actually a famous verse, and it's really an important verse. It's kind of philosophically and substantially, it's about the most important verse that we have come across so far in our study of Bhagavad Gita, verse 7. Now I'm confused about my duty and have lost all composure because of miserly weakness. In this condition, I'm asking you to tell me for certain what is best for me. Now I'm your disciple and a soul surrendered unto you. Please instruct me. I imagine many of you have heard this verse before. It's a verse which is quoted by Prabhupada, and devotees quote not infrequently, I would say. And it's really Arjuna's now coming to an extremely important point in the whole situation, despite his confusion. And the point is that, and you should be reading through the purport, because we're going to go through the purport, just, taking bits and pieces out here and there. So you read through. The point is that Arjuna is, as Prabhupada says in the purport, perplexed. He's perplexed, confused, you could say. He's perplexed. And so what does he do? He takes shelter of Krishna, or he takes shelter of a bona fide spiritual master, Krishna, who can give proper guidance. And Prabhupada goes on. There are, 3 paragraphs here. It's a fairly substantial purport. Prabhupada is basically examining this whole point, how all Vedic literatures advise us, except a spiritual master. Krishna did, Arjuna's doing it right here, Lord Ram did, Lord Caitanya did. They all accepted spiritual masters, because in this world, people need to accept spiritual masters. And like we see in the first paragraph, Prabhupada explains how the material world is very difficult. Sometimes it's said to be like a big forest fire. How did it start? Who knows? But it's there. And when it's there, you've got to deal with it. Otherwise, you'll be consumed by it. So, in order then to deal with the forest fire situation of life in this material world, one should accept a spiritual master. And in this way, gradually, under the direction of the spiritual master, one will be able to solve the perplexities. Yes, undo the perplexities and make everything nice. And Prabhupada says, it's an interesting point, a person with a bona fide spiritual master is supposed to know everything. Haribol. We've had some discussion on this from time to time here. And the way Prabhupada puts it, in one place at least, is that you should know whatever the spiritual master tells you. That's a way of understanding this idea that you know everything if you have a bona fide spiritual master. You should learn whatever the spiritual master imparts and really learn it. Although we also note that we were told many years ago that Srila Prabhupada was asked, do you know everything? And Srila Prabhupada, we were told, answered, no, I don't. But Krishna does, and he tells me. So that, anyway, one way or another, if one has a bona fide spiritual master and really utilizes the opportunity of having a bona fide spiritual master, then one can become very well situated in life. And particularly in the context here of being able to deal with perplexities. So then the discussion goes on into let us just read what the last sentence or two Prabhupada speaks in the first paragraph. One should not therefore remain in material perplexities, but should approach a spiritual master. This is the purport of this verse. Of course, the purport goes on. So the second paragraph is discussing who is the person who's in perplexity then? What sort of person? And citing, Prabhupada answers the question briefly. It is he who does not understand the problems of life. And then he quotes Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, which elaborates further that miserly person, a kripana, in the Sanskrit there from Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, you'll see that person's described as kripana, which means miser, a person who doesn't solve the problems of life, birth, death, old age, and disease, as a human, is a miser. And basically their life is wasted. Human form of life is such an asset. There's nothing else like it at all. And if you waste it, what a waste. It's a disaster. The Brahmins, they don't waste it. So then in the third and final paragraph, the Prabhupada discusses, first of all, how the kripanas, the miserly people who will not use the human form of life properly for solving the perplexities of life, how they waste their time in just family, society, love, friendship, all of that. What Prabhupada calls the skin disease. They think their family will save them from the problems of life. So Prabhupada goes on to explain that Arjuna was actually thinking like that. So he is in that category. He's in that foolish, miserly category of perplexed person who doesn't know how to solve the great problems of life. But there's a very important positive point in regards to Arjuna, that even though Arjuna is in that condition and he has exposed himself to be like that, in very embarrassing ways, but at least he wants a real solution. Therefore, he's approaching a spiritual master, Lord Krishna. And Prabhupada sums up at the end of the purport how Arjuna understands the Bhagavad Gita as stated in the Gita itself. And yet foolish mundane scholars explain that one need not submit to Krishna as a person, but to the quote-unquote unborn within Krishna. There's no difference between Krishnas within and without. And one who has no sense of this understanding is the greatest fool in trying to understand Bhagavad Gita. Anyway, it's a slightly different point to what we've been discussing. But for us, we can take it. Talks between the master and the disciple are serious, and now Arjuna wants to talk very seriously before the recognized spiritual master, Krishna. And we go on to 8. Arjuna, of course, has surrendered here in verse 7, but he hasn't quite, what would you say, realized the fruits of that surrender. He's still perplexed. He's surrendered in principle. He's ready, but his consciousness has not really changed yet. So he says, I can find no means to drive away this grief, which is drying up my senses. I'll not be able to dispel it, even if I win a prosperous, unrivaled kingdom on earth, with sovereignty like that of the demigods in heaven. It's another one of these long paragraphs. So Prabhupada explains that yes, and it's such an important point. Arjuna's made a number of arguments, suggestions, and things he feels he can do to solve what he sees as being the problem. But even though he's got all these ideas, we can do this, we can do that, we can protect the family traditions and whatever else, avoid sinful reaction. But still, he's perplexed. So his ideas have not solved his problem of perplexity. And so he can't solve his problems without the help of his spiritual master, Krishna. Only a spiritual master can help with these things. So now we need a spiritual master like Lord Krishna, not just some academic, because academic knowledge, etc., they're useless in solving the problems of life. So therefore the conclusion is that a spiritual master who's 100% Krishna conscious is the bona fide spiritual master. He can help you solve the problems. And then Prabhupada quotes Lord Caitanya, Kiba vipra kiba nyasi shudra kene noi, ye Krishna tattva veta se guru hoy. It doesn't matter who the person is from the social point of view, from point of view of upbringing or background or these considerations, whether the person is a Brahmin, a sannyasi, or a Sudra, even a Sudra, but if they know the science of Krishna, they can be accepted as a guru, whereas the next verse, which is quoted, that a scholarly Brahmin, expert in all subjects of Vedic knowledge, is unfit to become a spiritual master without being a Vaishnav or expert in the science of Krishna consciousness. But a person born in a family of a lower caste can become a spiritual master if he's a Vaishnav or Krishna conscious. So Prabhupada, for the rest of the purport, is basically exploring the point, like the next paragraph, second paragraph. Please read on. Prabhupada's making the point that the real problems of life, birth, old age, disease, and death, they cannot be solved by accumulating money, economic development, or military power, for that matter. If that were the case, then the Western world would have solved the problems of birth, death, old age, and disease, but they have not. So, therefore, that approach, forget that approach. We need the approach of Lord Krishna, the approach of Bhagavad Gita. And then Prabhupada, in the next paragraph, Prabhupada makes the point that if economic development and material comfort could effectively drive away lamentation, then Arjuna would not have said that I don't want an unrivaled kingdom. I don't want an unrivaled kingdom. He's already said it a couple of times. But if having an unrivaled kingdom, anyway, I think that point's fairly clear, that if an unrivaled kingdom could solve our problems, Arjuna wouldn't have any problems. Therefore, he's taking shelter of Krishna consciousness. And then Prabhupada summarizes at the end, therefore, if we want to curb lamentation for good, then we have to take shelter of Krishna as Arjuna is seeking to do. So Arjuna asked Krishna to solve his problem definitely, and that is the way of Krishna consciousness. So Arjuna, now's verse 9, and we'll see Arjuna, well, he's in between. He's in an in-between state. At heart, he knows what is right, and he's surrendered to Krishna, but he hasn't really put it into effect yet. Krishna hasn't really instructed him much, also just a few words. So this is now the final doubt the final doubt of Arjuna. Having spoken thus, Arjuna, chastiser of enemies, told Krishna, Govinda, I shall not fight, and fell silent. Yeah. So he's really in a state of confusion. Arjuna is fried. He wants to give up. We can imagine, because now Sanjay speaks this verse. Sanjay said, having spoken thus, Arjuna, chastiser of enemies, told Krishna, Govinda, I shall not fight, and fell silent. We can imagine Dhritarashtra became a little enlivened to hear that. But Sanjay, as usual, he's very clever. He refers to Arjuna as Parantapa, which means chastiser of enemies. He's not being sarcastic, but he knows it's a fact that generally Arjuna is a chastiser of enemies. So he's having a bit of a down period, but Krishna, he's surrendered to Krishna. Transformation is going to happen. So you better watch out, Dhritarashtra, Duryodhana, and company. So Prabhupada makes the point nicely in the purport. Although Arjuna was for the time being overwhelmed with false grief due to family affection, he surrendered unto Krishna, the Supreme Spiritual Master, as a disciple. This indicated that he would soon be free from the false lamentation, resulting from family affection, etc. So things are looking up step by step for Arjuna by the mercy of Krishna. So now, verse 10, Krishna is about to really start giving some serious instruction. This is now verse 10. O descendant of Bharat, at that time Krishna, smiling in the midst of both the armies, spoke the following words to the grief-stricken Arjuna. So, anyway, again, if you look through the purport, just look through the purport. I'll make a few points, which you could note down if you like. So now the thing is that the talk had been going on as friends, but now that friendly discussion is finished, and Arjuna has submitted himself as a disciple. Krishna is now going to really take the role of spiritual master, the superior position. Yes. So the whole sort of focus is changing like that. It's interesting that the verse says that Krishna was prahasan, smiling or like smiling. Krishna is becoming very grave, not just friendly. And Prabhupada makes the point that in the last part of the purport, it appears that the talk between master and disciple was openly exchanged in the presence of both armies so that all were benefited. So, in other words, Bhagavad Gita is for everyone. Prabhupada makes an interesting little comment. Listen to this. This is separately in a class on one of these verses here. So, Arjuna was very serious and Krishna was smiling. Just see the fool. What is he doing? Therefore, there was necessity of instructing Bhagavad Gita. The fool has to be instructed. He was smiling. He was very serious. Just like sometimes a child is very serious and the father smiles. So now Bhagavad Gita will be spoken. He has accepted Krishna as a spiritual master. Krishna will now instruct him. So we go on now. We're going to carry on for another 10 minutes, maybe, something like that. I want to note a particular point, is how Krishna defeats the different arguments of Arjuna in this chapter, starting with this section here from verse 11 to verse 30. So from verse 11 to verse 30, this is defeating the argument of compassion. We don't want anyone to die. From verse 11 to verse 30 is defeating the argument of not fighting. We shouldn't fight on compassionate grounds. Then verse 31 to 37 is defeating the ideas that if we fight, we won't enjoy. That's one type of idea. And if we fight, we will get sinful reactions. So those arguments of Arjuna are defeated in the section on Karma Kandya, Kshatriya Dharma, from verse 31 to verse 37. And then from verse 38 to verse 53, Krishna defeats the arguments that we should not fight, because if we do fight, we'll get sinful reactions. Yes. So like this, Krishna defeats the specific arguments that Arjuna has presented. So now let's go into section B here, the second part of the second chapter, which is titled Jnana, Fight. There's no death for the soul, and it goes from verse 11 to verse 30. Let me just inform you how this section B is divided into subsections. It's important. So there is a subsection from right now, verse 11 to verse 13, and then from verse 16 to verse 25. It's in two halves, verse 11 to verse 13, and then verse 16 to verse 25. And the idea is, death is just a matter of the soul changing bodies, so what's the big deal? Death is just a matter of the soul changing bodies, so it's not so important. Don't worry. Verse 11 to verse 13 and verse 16 to verse 25. It's just a matter of the soul changing bodies. Then from verse 14 to verse 15, the subject is that performing our duty must not be affected by sense perceptions. Performance of duty must not be affected by just how we see our sense perceptions. And then from verse 26 to verse 30, the idea is the soul can't be killed, but the body can't be saved, so fight. Soul can't be killed, body can't be saved, so just fight. Why not? Yeah. I hope you got those. Let us just jump in. We've still got a couple of minutes. To verse 11. And it's Krishna's, he's already chastised. He's given some instructions, it's a fact. But this is now more specific. This is more like really philosophical. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, while speaking learned words, you're mourning for what is not worthy of grief. Those who are wise lament, neither for the living nor for the dead. So again, like we've been saying, please look through the purport now. Have a look at the purport. So, first, really major point is that Krishna again is showing he doesn't appreciate Arjuna's ideas. He's calling him a fool. Wise people don't do what you're doing, so you're not wise. Means you're a fool. Then we shouldn't be lamenting for any stage of the body. We shouldn't lament for any stage of the body in the living or dead condition. Arjuna, Prabhupada makes the point, Arjuna has been arguing for material religious principles. Things like that. But now Krishna is going to talk about spiritual principles. Krishna is going to talk about knowledge of matter, the soul and the supreme. And as Prabhupada says, the body is born and is destined to be vanquished today or tomorrow. Therefore, the body is not as important as the soul. One who knows this is actually learned, and for him, there's no cause for lamentation, regardless of the condition of the material body. So that's a little introduction there to this section, very important section, from verse 11 to verse 30, clarifying, explaining what is the soul and what is not the soul. Let me just read the last little comment Prabhupada makes from a class on verse 11. Similarly, Krishna, just after taking the position of the spiritual master, is designating Arjuna as a total fool. Caitanya Mahaprabhu also said, my spiritual master found me a great fool. Was Caitanya Mahaprabhu a fool? Is it possible that anyone can become the spiritual master of Caitanya Mahaprabhu? Both are impossible. Both are impossible. Caitanya Mahaprabhu, even if we don't accept him as an incarnation of God, if you simply accept him as ordinary scholar or ordinary man, there was no comparison of his scholarship. Shri Shri Radharadhanath, Shri Giri Govardhan, Shri Caitanya Mahaprabhu, Ke Jai. Just stick with me for another minute, maximum 2. Sit down and relax. So Caitanya Mahaprabhu, even if you don't accept him as incarnation of Krishna, if you simply accept him as ordinary scholar or ordinary man, there was no comparison of his scholarship. But he said, my spiritual master found me a great fool. What does it mean? A person, even in my position, always remains a fool before his spiritual master. That is good for him. Nobody should impose upon the spiritual master that, what do you know? I know better than you. So yes, so Lord Caitanya, he said like that, my Guru Mora Murkadeki Karilashasan. My spiritual master found me a great fool. What does that mean? It means that a person, even in the position of Lord Caitanya, always remains a fool before his spiritual master. That is good for him. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai.